This is a short introduction to aspects of the history of this society. It is an introduction to a full version which includes further aspects of this history as well as aspects of the history of pediatrics. In brief, Warkany changed the world and society in that he played a main role in the elimination of a nearly universal dogma. This dogma asserted that congenital anomalies were genetic in nature and that for the most part were inherited from flawed parents. His efforts invalidated the dogma. In his own words, a child suffering from congenital malformations can no longer be dogmatically held as a portent of parental flaws, nor can a fetus be considered immune from environmental assaults. Warkany is a native of Vienna and studied medicine at its famous medical school. He often mentions that in his neighborhood and not far away from it lived many dreamers, like Hitler, Freud, Herzl, Mahler. But he also claims that he didn't dream dreams. Warkany asserted that he dreamed on solid grounds and attributed this solidity to his mentors. In the interest of brevity, I will not describe them much except focus on the great concepts that he attributed them to have endowed him with. Medical ethics, concerning Rokitansky, the importance of indirect prevention, stressed by Wagner-Jauregg, the importance of the host, and not just the theology, stressed by von Pirquet, and the importance of clinical research, stressed by Belashik. These leaders of medicine, along with Warkany, are giants of the history of medicine, pediatrics, teratology, and much more. The solid grounds upon which Warkany flourished were described in an article some years ago. A current article in the journal of this society includes some aspects of the critical experiences of Josef Warkany when he served as a consultant to the March of Dimes, induced them to shift attention from poliomyelitis to birth defects, and eventually became convinced of the necessity to create this society. This introduction to a full video presentation concerns elements that are not possible to include in a hard print article just mentioned. The full version includes live interviews, images, galleries, etchings, adages, and other elements that, in the interest of brevity, will also be only shown partially in this introduction. The full video companion includes 14 video snippets, among them segments where Warkany speaks about his magnum opus and other issues such as the dead disease, acrodenia, a major victory in his pediatric research efforts, and so forth. Now maybe we should listen to him what he said about his years in Vienna.
You told me that you started off in architectural school in Vienna, and how come you changed from architecture to medicine, and we nearly missed this opportunity of sitting in this room, I would guess?
Well, there is a complicated history. about this. I was born in Vienna, but my citizenship was Hungarian, and and I graduated from high school or the gymnasium. I wasn't admitted as a citizen to the medical school, but I was admitted to architecture. So I went into architecture and I studied there for 4 days. And then I found out that the colleagues there were better than I in projective geometry, in drawing, and so on. In the meantime, the political situation changed, and I became a citizen of Austria, and now was admitted to the medical school. That's how I switched from architecture to medical school. And
who got you into pediatrics, Joe?
I chose it because I wanted to specialize and not to be specialized. And pediatrics is a science where you treat the whole patient, or a branch of medicine. I realize that now my wife has a broken hip, and to find a doctor who looks not only at the heart or at the hip, but also at the foot where she has a blister, that's hard to find. And
that is one doctor, in other words.
the pediatrician looks at the heart and the heel.
Not anymore.
And the heel.
Yeah, no. Sure it is.
No, really, it was the idea to have a little child that you could look over from head to foot. And I haven't regretted that.
Your pediatric training was in Vienna then?
In Vienna. And the first one, I was, I think, a year and a half at the clinic of the famous PK, or von PK, as you say here.
The test.
Oh, yes.
Wasn't that the tuberculin test?
Well, he's
See what I remember from my pediatrics?
Of course.
Of course, all right.
But do you know that he is the man who made the word allergy and the concept of allergy? He was one of the greatest. And, but he was, how should I say, an unusual man, but a very great one. He had the big concepts, which I liked and which impressed me most. Like concept of allergy. To him, the contagious diseases were allergic diseases. The virus got into you and the body reacted to it, and he described that and so on. By the way, his first assistant was Bela Schick, whose name you know too.
He came here to
He
this country
came here
last
and
year.
was in New York.
I met him once.
Yes. He left the clinic before I got into the clinic, but we met later, and he was very fine.
And soon after Warkany left the March of Dimes, he applied all his efforts to create a teratology society along with many distinguished colleagues. He was elected by acclamation its first president, to be followed by James Wilson. And as shown here, the three presidents, Josef Warkany, James Wilson, and Clark Fraser, provided the initial firm foundations upon which the Teratology Society stands today. Warkany was immensely fortunate to leave Vienna for Cincinnati, where he lived the rest of his life. The fortunate is not an exaggeration. Unless we are interested in the prevention as well as the cure, we have all of us failed. That is not what Warkany said, but certainly that's what he believed deeply. That was the mantra of Albert Graham Mitchell, who collected a group of very distinguished pediatricians and investigators. And these efforts were energized by another idealist philanthropist, Mr. William Proctor, who donated nearly $50 million in today's terms to energize these efforts, which then made reality into a pediatric research foundation that stands and is still very active today and has achieved many, many landmarks to enhance the prevention of developmental anomalies in children. And indeed, the ideal of Mitchell was continued by Warkany, who in his words said that from a medical point of view, no disease can be considered fully investigated and understood until it can be prevented and eliminated. Otherwise, he also stated, treatment is not the main question, prevention is. And Warkany had a real loudspeaker. He spoke to the whole world through the textbook of pediatrics edited by Waldo Nelson, another member of the team he belonged to. Waldo Nelson took the responsibility of Mitchell's textbook of pediatrics and made it world famous, a Bible for all pediatricians for many decades, and is still ongoing. Warkany humbly said that it was necessary to prepare society to accept new ideas about environmental causes of disruptions of the embryo and fetus, because the dogma that held these were only of genetic nature was deeply rooted in most societies. He stressed in chapter after chapter, decades before the establishment of medical genetics and teratology societies, the importance of prenatal factors in diseases of children, the importance to counsel parents, and very often in private he marveled, why do they call it genetic counseling? Why do they call these clinics genetic clinics? And we leave others to ponder this question and perhaps even find an answer. Among the video snippets that we will not show in the interest of brevity, there are some dedicated to his magnum opus, Congenital Malformations, Notes and Comments, which arose in parallel to his articles in the textbook of Nelson. Over 2 decades, Warkany collected information and organized it, and finally in 1971, after nearly 2 decades of preparation, he put this classic book to see the light of the world. In it are facts, and therefore they are unlikely to ever become outdated. When Warkany confronted the dogma mentioned earlier, popularized by the son of Darwin and even by other investigators such as Fisher and population geneticists, he knew that he was going to touch sensitive areas of the discipline of genetics, its evolution toward eugenics, racism, euthanasia, and Holocaust, but nonetheless he persevered and insisted, and eventually the victory was his. He knew that this dogma was deeply rooted in the United States as well, and it had links with standard business practices and profit-making enterprises. Nonetheless, he did not withdraw his efforts and continued and continued and continued. And his interest was not limited to teratogens. He single-handedly eliminated a disease once quite common called acrodynia, and even after he found the cause, years later wrote a very, very provocative paper called The Postmortem of a Dead Disease, because he wanted to stress that knowing the scientific cause of a disease did not imply that it would be prevented. And in fact, there are many disorders of fetal development where the cause is known, but prevention does not appear to be widespread. For instance, iodine fortification of salt took over 100 years to make inroads. Fortification of bread with folic acid still is not implemented in many developed societies. So he stressed that science and dogmas often coexist, and science have to be enhanced. Scientists have to be dedicated to the prevention as an ongoing responsibility. And to this end, he speaks in quite a few snippets of television interviews that are included in the version and may be of interest to many of you. Another characteristic of Warkany was ability to recognize talent and creativity. For one example, we can present Dr. Jack Rubinstein, a pioneer worldwide famous for his dedication to the prevention of mental subnormality, to special clinics such as the Rubinstein-Tybee syndrome, and the Cincinnati Children's Research Foundation continues to emphasize the central role of mental subnormality in the gamut or perspectives of teratogenic impacts on the developing child. His snippets on the subject of developmental disorders and mental retardation are illuminating, and very often in private he would worry that scientists dedicated to teratology very often were not sufficiently aware and sufficiently dedicated to functional disorders such as mentioned here. The broad scope of achievements of Warkany was recognized by the John Howard Award that he received from the American Pediatric Society. This represents the highest honor that a famous and important research association can grant to a pediatrician. Here he stands next to Sabin, and on the extreme left stands Waldo Nelson. These three great figures of medicine came from Cincinnati, where they collaborated with each other for many, many years. One recurrent dream that Warkany mentioned to me was that he felt that one way to keep him alive was to ensure that upcoming generations of teratologists knew about his magnum opus, Congenital Malformation, for in it are facts that are hard to find anywhere else. And I find that in this book there is also many, many contents that provide wisdom and notions of humanism and medical ethics. This is illustrated by the figure showing at its center Hans Zellweger, Warkany's friend and colleague. On the right is an upcoming teratologist, a fully trained pediatrician dedicated to study the science, and on the left is myself. 3 generations of physicians, clinicians interested and competent in the field of teratology. And a presentation about the life of Warkany is incomplete without paying some attention to his etchings, because, willingly or not, he spoke of his societal, political, and other views. Otherwise, he very often was very silent about these subjects. So this is the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you visit the full version and also take a look at the formal reports. Please note the links given below, and until then, please accept my very best wishes.